Hello and welcome to 4315. Today we're speaking with Ty, who was fired from his position as a tour guide at Yellowstone National Park for engaging in organizing activity. Okay, let's start with the more basic question. What's your name and what exactly do you do or did you do at Yellowstone before you were fired?
So my name is Ty Wheeler. Myself, along about seven of us, we were all guiding in Yellowstone in doing winter tours. So if you go to Yellowstone in the winter, you have to take a tour guide in to get into the park. And we were taking folks into America's best idea and giving them the time of their lives.
What does the day-to-day look like for you?
Great question. Yeah, so since the laws have changed to access to Yellowstone in the wintertime, it used to be anybody could come in. When I was a kid, we would take snowmobiles in with our family, go into the park and have our own adventure. But now you have to go in with a guide. So folks show up on a bus into West Yellowstone. That's the main hub because it's close enough to Old Faithful. You can come in through the other entrances, but it's a little further distance. So about 75%, 80% of Yellowstone's winter tourists show up on a bus. They come on to our snowmobiles or our snow coaches, and then we take them into the park and make sure that, when there's bison, that we go around the bison and don't get gored, that we can point out some of the thermal features and some of the wildlife and safely do it. That's the most important thing, is that we get into wherever we want to go in the wintertime. It can get very cold, minus 40, minus 45 degrees, and then make it back out with all the people that we came in with. That's the goal every day. And then also to have a really good time. So usually that trip takes about 8 hours. You show up, they hop on the snowmobile or the snow coach, as we call them. They're giant, big inflatable tires. We also have some coaches that have tracks and skis on the front, and so you can put 8 or 9 folks in, and you go in, you can take photos and see Yellowstone in the wintertime. And that's what we did.
That honestly sounds like a lot of fun.
It's a heck of a lot of fun. Definitely, almost 4 million people visit Yellowstone in the summertime, less than 100,000 visit in the wintertime. So if you want to get away from the crowds and do that, it is a pretty unique experience. And it used to all be family-run companies that ran all of these trips into Yellowstone.
And that honestly brings me to what I was going to ask you next. So guides are employed by Delaware North, not Yellowstone directly, right?
Yeah, so what Yellowstone decided to do was Delaware North has come in and bought up the contracts that the family, including the company that I was working for before, they bought up those contracts to operate in the park. So even though you might think you're going with a family-run company, like Two Top or Yellowstone Vacation Tours, it is a separate contract, and they get to decide what's said, and how everything is operated. Yellowstone itself has a very much hands-off approach to allowing Delaware North to operate those contracts.
So why exactly was how did that happen? Delaware North, why aren't you employed by these family-owned companies anymore? Why is it Delaware North? I mean, how did that end up happening?
So if you operate inside of Yellowstone, you're under a lot more regulation. By operating outside of Yellowstone and buying up the companies and the real estate around the national park, there's a lot less regulation and a lot higher profit margins to be had by owning all of the access. So by buying all the small family companies, they're owning your access to get into Yellowstone. It's quite clever. Warren Buffett even quoted something called his perfect business model is owning a toll bridge to somewhere. So we kind of started calling it the Oversnow Toll Bridge to get into Yellowstone that they've bought up.
So, the American Prospect reported that in winter of 2019, tourists started bringing COVID into Yellowstone. Now, our understanding is this is part of what inspired the organizing efforts, but what were the wages like? And I also saw something in there about sporadic scheduling. Like, what were the things that led you guys to really start organizing there?
Yeah. So, you know, this is another thing is because access is so limited in Yellowstone, my personal belief is that American taxpayers should have the first right to visit our national parks when access is limited. Delaware North happened to take in the highest percentage of international tourists by far than any of the other smaller family run companies that were left that they didn't buy out. So we had pretty high exposure pretty early on. And so our guests were telling us some stories of these things, but do we take them seriously? People were concerned, but they were still coming. So there weren't a lot of efforts to mitigate or to have an intelligent conversation over why there were guides that were in lockdown or employees in lockdown early on, just because there was a lot of people with gastrointestinal illnesses in the park. And it was just it was a weird time. It was like, what is this? Scheduling wise, they had brought on, once they purchased the family run companies, they didn't communicate their scheduling. So you wouldn't know until a couple days before, or maybe even an hour before. They might call you in the morning and say, we need you to run a trip right now. So we had guides that were making maybe $100 a week, maybe $200 a week, barely able to pay their rent back to Delaware North. And they were ending up in the food bank line. I was doing okay. There was a couple others that were okay because we've been around for a while. And we had requests from previous guests to come on. But overall, it was kind of a dire situation for a lot of folks, ending up in a food bank line when a company has a government contract to run these trips. To me, is unethical. I serve my country. I expect Americans to be treated with respect and to be taken care of when, on an average day, if you look at the number of trips that are run, Delaware North was making about $84,000 to $90,000 per day and paying in direct wages less than $4,000. So the question became, why not at least pay people enough if you're not going to give them enough trips that they can eat? Like, simple question, right?
Yeah.
So that's what really pushed our effort to just start that question of what constitutes a livable wage and a decent life in America.
Yeah, absolutely. And did they offer you guys any like healthcare benefits there, or is that just something that's like not even offered?
Yeah, that's not really pushed in any way. An actual, besides you, with how much you're making, you wouldn't be. Most folks wouldn't be able to afford a healthcare deductible anyway. So most folks are on government subsistence that were there, which for a state of Montana, and this is speaking to Montanans specifically, when you put the burden on other working individuals to pay for healthcare and to pay for food for your employees in the same state while you're making a killing, how is that ethical? These are questions that we're really trying to get at and change.
So once Delaware North learned that you were organizing, their response was to basically spread fear that you're going to lose shifts. But I know there was more than that. Do you want to talk about what management's response was once they realized that you were organizing?
It was actually far quicker than that, John. They just fired everyone that had their name on it. So what we did was we were copying, or not copying exactly. We were working off another model that guides had used elsewhere to unionize, and we were looking at this, going, man, we're working so hard out here in this very cold environment, and you only make 140, $150 an entire day, and only working a couple days, really long days, and just saying, oh, hold on a minute. How did this other company, and how are these other workers treated elsewhere? So we took that model and we found that the workers were making 5 to 6 times what we were. I did far better when I worked for a family-run company that took care of us in a little better way. And so it was just saying, okay, well, let's write this out. So we had an 80-page prospectus for unification, identifying healthcare, sick pay. If you're sick, what does that look like? And what's the base wage? And these little nuances that started to look like, okay, well, that would be at a minimum a reasonable expectation of an employer for just to provide. So we had that document, and somebody leaked it. We gave it to, which I wasn't too concerned about, because we were going to basically try to have a vote for a union and present this to management and just say, hey, let's do this quickly. And then management brought folks in and fired them within the hours of that document leaking. So that was, there wasn't much of a, and then other folks, I didn't even know, and this is the other thing, for many people that might listen to this podcast, and workers in general in America, we have a lot of intelligent people in America, especially in our generation, that have no idea what their rights are. Know your rights. I didn't know. I didn't know what the NLRB was. I just wanted to have a living wage and a conversation. And I didn't know until there was a representative from the state of Montana that came down to picket with us and told us what our rights were, and that it was illegal for them to fire folks. So that's what started this whole mess, was they fired 4 of us, and then I wasn't fired yet till the next Monday after I picketed with Sophie. But, it's a rural town. They were forced out of company housing, and people had to move to Utah within hours. So the company had full leverage, your housing, your food, all of that. All, they could just hold it on a string. And so that's a huge leverage factor for them to hold, especially in these rural towns.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, specifically about the company housing. So they're not required to, even if you get fired, to give you like a 30-day heads up to go find other housing. It's damn near impossible to find housing, in a matter of days. Even a week is tough.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So there's no sort of contract to give people kind of leeway if they decide to leave the company or if they get terminated. Like, there's no safeguard there for any of those people.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow.
They kind of give a blanket statement, like, we'll give you a few days type of deal, but the housing is such that you've got 2 to 4 people per room. This isn't per apartment, per room. So a lot of the wages go back. It's not a ton of money per person, but when you're $250 for rent for a quarter of a room, they're making $1,000 per room down there. And this is when COVID's breaking out. So, the questions then become, well, hold on a minute. This is, they have all the leverage. It's a company town, basically. West Yellowstone has become a Delaware North company town. If you look at the footprint and the companies that they've bought in the last 4 years, it's incredible. They bought the Holiday Inn, the Grey Wolf Hotel. They bought 2 different apartment buildings. They bought an old motel that they started putting folks in. And then 1, 2, 3 guiding companies they purchased out. And then one in the north part of the park and east side too. So they're kind of like, circling around Yellowstone and buying everything up. And then, especially, for example, the floods happened this year, and they fired folks instead of offering them relocation. It's just amazing.
Yeah, honestly, I was gonna ask you about those floods, because I was reading an article that came out. I think it was a couple months ago, or maybe it was sooner. But they were talking about the flooding and how they gave some of the workers who, after they shut down, they gave some of the workers less than 48 hours to find housing.
Yeah, that's what was reported. So they had folks that moved all the way out there to work, And, these jobs traditionally, there's a degree of variability, but the guiding especially, it took a long time to get in those positions. But Delaware North has had phenomenal turnover, which is what you want when you want to keep new folks coming in and have no idea what they're getting themselves into. So, that's important to ask those questions of how they handle situations in a community. In Montana, we don't just kick people out. The community, when stuff, you bond together. And there are entities in Gardner, for example, Jim Halfpenny, some other folks, amazing humans that ran, campaigns to raise money to put people in housing and feed people and build the community back. And Delaware North, in the meantime, was firing folks and just saying, yeah, well, I don't know, man, too bad luck. And if that's the new America, right? If that's what we're getting into, is a bipartisan, well, too bad, you're not making us money right now. That's why we're seeing the social issues we're seeing in this country, is we have to hold the folks that hold all the strings accountable. So I digress on that point. But yeah, you're right. That's exactly what happened out there.
No, we're right there with you. We totally agree. I mean, you got to hold people accountable, which brings me to my next question, and feel free to answer as much or as little as you'd like about it. But after the firings, you all filed with the NLRB, and it was found that you were retaliated against, and you received a settlement, and that Yellowstone and Delaware North, there was a stipulation in there about rehiring. So you still haven't been rehired. Could you elaborate on this situation, like I said, as much or as little as you'd like?
So again, a lot of folks don't know their rights. We didn't know ours to the full degree. Some of the folks who were fired, and I want to point out that among those that were fired were NPS rangers that work in the park and work in other national parks. These are public servants that try to bring to attention to the American public, like, hey, maybe the narrative of our national park should be held to a higher standard, and that the people that provide that narrative should have a better life. So when we were fired, it was a weird time because COVID was happening. March 15th, of course. We were fired on February 14th through about the 18th. Delaware North figured out that they messed up when we filed the charges. So other folks that got involved were what we call constructively discharged. It's where they don't put them on the schedule, or maybe once or twice, every other week you get a trip, or every other week you work, or they put you in a crappy different job that isn't in your job description. That's called constructively discharging. So we had those on the record as well. And keep in mind that this was the NLRB and labor. All of these things are highly political. So at the base level, was there gross mishandling and of how they handled this? Yes, we had 11 definitive charges that were what's called found with merit by the NLRB. We had some other charges that we couldn't prove to a higher enough degree, but were there. We had a 10J injunction that we had requested, which is pretty serious, just saying, hey, we need to stop on this. But it was a hard time because COVID's starting to come out. There was a lot of change happening very quickly at the national level. So Trump's NLRB head, Mr. Robb, who was the head of the NLRB at the time, was starting to just throw these cases out like hotcakes, just saying, hey, this is a great excuse for companies to say, we can't guarantee your job. We can't guarantee anything. Treat people how you want. So he was throwing all these cases out. And I want to make another point in that politically, if you look at who was fired of the guides, we had everybody across the spectrum. I'm pretty middle of the road. You had conservative, liberal, leaning, I call it, individuals that were all asking, like, let's have a better life, right? So he was throwing, Mr. Robb at the national level was throwing everybody's cases out. So our case manager just said, hey, Delaware North hired this big banging law firm called Safarth Law Firm out of Chicago. They're dumping a ton of money at this. You guys, they've offered you back pay because they called the cops on us. They had the cops come out and say we weren't legally allowed to picket, which legally, folks, if you're listening to this, you're legally allowed to exercise your rights on any public property. In the national park, you might have to get a special permit for the area that you're going to go to. But just know that, because the cops told us we couldn't do that. Turns out you can. And so that was one of the charges we had. Police were called on us. And so they agreed to pay us back pay for the time that we missed, as well as forward pay for another year, another season, because the charges were so egregious. We wanted to take them and not settle. We wanted to take this to the court, and this is where the PRO Act comes in. Had the PRO Act been passed and we took this to court, we would have been able to go after damages, been able to go off more of our lost time, because it wasn't very much pay. Let's be honest. It was the bare minimum that they could provide. We could have gone after all of that and really held them accountable. For Delaware North, what they paid to us was less than 1/10 of what they net profit make in a day, just off the guided trips. So for them, it's a no-brainer. For companies, it's a no-brainer to just fire folks and not. And that was under the Trump inauguration. It's getting better. So that's where I'm getting to with the next phase that you asked about, which is where are we now? So we settled, but with that expectation that all this would come off of our record and we could reapply to the jobs that we previously held. And so we said in that agreement is we will remove from our files all references to the early layoffs or constructive discharges, and then it lists all of our names. And then we will notify them in writing that this has been done, and that this is the key part. The early layoff or constructive discharge will not be used against them in any way. This is part of our agreement. So this says that we can apply for these positions moving forward. Come last year, we reapplied, went to the head of the NLRB. We believed we had a very good case, and just saying, it's pretty obvious we had this agreement. We're great candidates. Not a single one of us have ever had a negative review. They had people working for them that have been arrested. Indecent exposure was one of the charges against one of the guides that Delaware North really liked. These are the type of people that companies want to retain because they can control them. So we're hitting a point in moral discrepancy with these companies where that's who's being retained. So we said, hey, we're pretty good candidates. We should be able to be rehired. In fact, the field agents certainly thought so from the NLRB that drew up our new charges. So anytime you have something that's bad that's happened, it's a new charge. So they put those new charges up to the head of the regional office in Seattle, Ronald Hooks, and he denied our charge. I don't want to go, I don't know Mr. Hooks personally. I do question having myself serve my country and believing that a lot of these narratives have a little bit of flexibility in them. We're learning that with a lot of the judges that are in power in this country. For the NLRB, regional offices matter. How you decide some of these things can go either way depending on who's in charge. Politics matter. So I would ask that the NLRB looks at the specifics of these charges and realizes that we're just workers trying to go up against these billion-dollar companies that have all of these attorneys that can split hairs. This, to me, this statement that we were going for should have been held, I believe, to a higher degree of authority, and the charges upheld. So we're going to continue fighting these charges. We do have new ones that we're starting soon, but this is how we've gotten to the point that only 10% of Americans are able to advocate for a better work life. So we need our public servants to fight, not just kind of sit back and decide tentatively where the law is held on both sides of the aisle, right? I mean, what's amazing to me is a lot of these workers in this country that are conservative are kind of being thrown under the bus by a lot of these decisions that are being made. And and easily manipulated. So yeah, that's where we're at right now. We will be filing a new charge in the next couple months.
So let me ask you this: based on all your experience, what advice would you give to somebody out there who might be thinking about organizing their workplace?
Well, man, that is a great question. It's interesting because I've sat on the other side. I've run my own business, and I understand how hard it is, and how you look at this as an employee. You're working really hard, right? Family-run companies in small towns, it doesn't make sense. You just kind of, everybody takes care of each other no matter what. And we're seeing this everywhere now. If you're working for a company that's making a lot of money, visualize that. If you're working for Amazon, visualize Jeff Bezos on his yacht and just say, am I able to feed my family? And visualize what you want. That's the most important thing. And knowing exactly what you want and saying, okay. And then talking with your other coworkers off the, not so that management can hear, right? And having some kind of drafting it up, writing it out and saying, this is what we want. And then being quick about it, talking to the AFL-CIO and get advice. These are consultants that are there for you to say, okay, this is how you do this. This is who you want to talk to, and this is who you don't want to talk to. I have gotten probably 30 emails from folks all around Yellowstone saying, hey, we saw what you did. We're so miserable. I'm going to go talk to management. And I have to say, no, don't go talk to management and say you want, because and this has happened. And then they get put in a different job, or they're fired, or just demeaned, right? It's part of the tactic. That's the low level tactic, is management says, are you not happy I don't think you're happy with your job here. How about, do you want to go wash dishes for the rest of the day? Or maybe you want this crap. That might make you motivated to think differently. So don't talk to management. Talk to your fellow workers and talk to the AFL-CIO and get a representative immediately. That gives you protection so that if anything happens, you have recourse. So that's the most important thing, is finding the AFL-CIO in your state, contact them immediately, and having a game plan instead of just trying on your own. That was kind of our mistake. I don't know, maybe you guys can talk about some of I'm curious where you might have done better. We definitely could have done better on that end. Having more support.
On that, we didn't. We made mistakes. The name of the podcast is 4315. Like, we made a ton of mistakes, and part of what we're trying to do is figure out what we did right, or what other people did right, what they did wrong. And like with you, what were your mistakes? If you want to put them out there, and because the mistakes are a learning tool. If you want to talk about it.
I think I underestimated the fact that people that were on our side tentatively, once we were fired, some of the workers that weren't having great performance numbers were the first ones to walk across the picket lines. We had union members, there was a firefighter from California whose pension was probably $250,000 because of the fact that he was able to get that pension because of unions. He was one of the first ones to walk across our line. And that's tough, I don't know the answer to that question of how you convince those people who have enough to join you in a fight. How did you guys, find that whenever it came up, the folks that, the ones that are definitely with you? We had a few join us that I didn't even think were with us, which was great. But had we had 2 more people that joined our picket line, Delaware North would have had to cancel trips. It would have been in violation of their federal contract. We'd be in a whole different boat right now. 2 people. Because they ran on the bare minimum. They had their managers out running trips to be able to cover enough manpower to keep the park open.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what did you guys see with on your end, I'm just curious that with folks that voted against you, what kind of, it kind of broke my heart. It's like, well, you know what? We tried to make everyone's lives better. And you taking this trip, I understand people with families. We had folks with families that were like, look, if I don't run this trip, I can't feed my kids, but we support you. I have no grudges against those folks. Those are good, hardworking people that literally, when you've got a 5-year-old that you have to feed, that's a tough one. But when we had other people that didn't necessarily need that went across our line, it makes me sad that I couldn't convince those people to join the boat and make their lives better and everybody else's lives better. How did you guys feel when you saw the boat come back?
Well, I mean, it was devastating. Like, I mean, let's just say that right off the bat. It was really frustrating. But one thing, and I say this all the time, it was a matter of us more so pitting ourselves against management and spending all of our time trying to combat the misinformation that we were receiving from management instead of focusing on the material conditions that we were all working under. So what could have been us reaching out to people and explaining to them, like, hey, we could be making this much more. Our benefits could be this much better. Oh, hey, look at this safety issue. We need to fix this. It was like, well, management said this, management said that. And it just became this like divisive back and forth. One of my biggest regrets during that entire time, you got to focus on more of what you have in common with people than the differences you have with management. That's my takeaway from it anyway. I like how you flipped the interview here, asking me questions.
No, because you said it perfectly. Because I was like, that is exactly what happened in our case. And Delaware North, and I've actually sat with, I used to guide the wealthiest Americans executives in Europe. And they'd share things around the dinner table that would probably make your skin crawl, but it works.
Probably.
How you sow, and I'll give you a good example of Napoleon. We hear divide and conquer, right? Napoleon didn't take over the world by dividing and conquering other countries. He divided his own ranks to fight against each other for better positions, and then that made them fight harder for him. And that's exactly the tactic that these companies use.
Absolutely.
Is dividing within the ranks so that you work harder and focus on stupid stuff that doesn't make any difference.
No, that's great. That is a great way to put it.
Yeah, and I think never underestimate the value of a turkey and a pizza party. So that's a tactic that Delaware North has used every time they go into, was they give everyone like a turkey or like throw a dinner party for folks and give a token amount and this is key, you give it to the preschool. So that will make every parent, that the value of that dollar that they gave to the preschool, man, I got to tell you, people will defend that dollar. Like, they help my kids. And I'm like, you would make 3 times what you would otherwise. But that they gave $10,000 or something to the local school. When I ran my own business, a small business, we gave, I think, $30,000 away through a lot of our nonprofit stuff. So here's a multi-billion-dollar company that gives $10,000 to a preschool, and everyone's defending them like they're the savior of the community, and they're the ones who are firing folks when things go bad. That's not community, and people need to realize that. A pizza party and a turkey, they like to throw pizza parties or give a turkey, isn't a substitution for a living wage, healthcare, and a quality life.
Well, you see, at No Evil Foods, they gave us a tofurkey, and then they threatened to take it away in the anti-union meetings.
And people probably were like, oh no. They're not gonna
Pretty much, yeah. No.
And then you lose your narrative. It's amazing. It's like, yeah, and that's where we've gone. I was in a business meeting in 2005 that predicted a lot of this stuff. This shift towards, short quick statements that people will buy into instead of long narratives. They were talking about how millennials are more distracted than any other generation and easily manipulated. And in some ways, I think they're right. And that's very sad to me. It is the crux of how can we find that unity? And I think that's the biggest question of our generation. How do we find that unity and defend it and fight for it? And I hope we can. And like you said, we were doing the same thing. We were like, hey, you'll make this much more. You'll have guaranteed retirement next year. We'll have health care. You're sick today? I mean, it's 42 below right now, and you got a cold. Well, guess what? You'd have a sick day that you could take and have paid for that and be able to take off and not get everyone sick, which is a whole nother subtopic with COVID. People are working and spreading all this stuff. As a society, like this, the working class just gets hammered with this stuff, and we need to fight for it. But we don't have a lot of bandwidth because there's a lot of folks right now barely getting by. And, I think one of the positives that came out of COVID, because we were kind of on the front end. We were before Chris Smalls and Amazon, same time as you guys kind of, on the front end of this giant movement that didn't happen out of accident. There's a reason people are doing this. And that frustration you feel when you're trying to do something good and then get punished for it. Man, that's a tricky one.
Honestly, not to make it too much about No Evil Foods, but I think about that a lot. How we were on the front end of all of this organizing that was happening, and if they hadn't done what they did and they actually recognized the union and they decided to not fight us but work with us, they would have been at the forefront of all of this stuff. They would have been one of the first companies at the beginning of this giant wave of unionizations to recognize a union and embrace unionization and embrace their workers' rights.
Set the positive
Set
example.
the precedent. And same with you, they would have been right at the beginning of it.
And here's the crazy part is I've been on the other side of that thought process, running my own stuff and just thinking of, it's hard to have employees. I don't know if you've ever had employees as your own business. It is a lot of work, but then, and you want to have, and think in their terms, right? They want maximum capital to grow because there's a common moniker in business where if you're not growing, you're dying. You can't just maintain. And we're changing though. We've used up so much of our resources in this country. We're hitting a point where we need to maintain better. We're done with growth. Like, let's put a break on growth and just maintain what we've got. And the French taught me this. It was hard for me to learn this, that a working person can have a very good life. And they do. They really do. In those rural areas, you're drinking, really nice bottles of wine, eating very good food. The children are very healthy, balanced lifestyles, 6 weeks of paid vacation per year. I mean, shoot, we were trying to get 2 weeks of paid vacation per year.
Yeah.
And that was too much,
Yeah.
That's another piece of advice. Travel. Go see how other people in the rest of the developed world live that work. And then you'll see, wow, we're getting shafted big time.
So, to kind of wrap it up a little bit, let me ask you this. Are you on social media, or is there anywhere that people can go to support you and follow what's going on with organizing efforts at Yellowstone? And, what can people do to support you?
That is a great question. So we're in something called a media desert. I didn't have Twitter or really even Facebook before this. You look at even the congressional candidates, and some of them, I mean, we're talking like 1,000 followers is what some of the folks had that ran for Congress, and they win,
Yeah.
So it's been hard for us. I think just raising awareness, going to Labor Lab, what you guys are doing, and following that, the AFL-CIO. We have a Twitter handle called @isrolling_, like Teddy Roosevelt is rolling in his grave is the concept. So we are it's been hard because we work full-time jobs plus doing other things now while we're fighting this. So write your congressman. If you listen to this and you Google Delaware North and see that you don't believe that the naming rights of national parks should be bought out and the American public buys them back, and union busting and your access to Yellowstone shouldn't be held, write your congressman. Let them know that stuff matters to you. That's the most important thing too, is keeping an eye on politics, because now more than ever, politics matter. Some of these smaller events, it's really hard to. There's so many distractions right now. Local politics matter just as much as national politics, if not, I'd say more. And I think the narrative here is look at your own workplace and how you can improve and find unity with each other. We're an independent culture. That's the narrative, is if you can just take this lesson into your own life, that'll start pushing back and building the wave that we need. Just like a small stone gets shaped into a little pebble, wave after wave after wave on a beach. That's what we need right now. All these little victories. That matters more than a tweet or some of this other stuff right now, is everybody in your own community working really hard, writing your congressman, and doing what I call actions that translate as much as you can. So we can build that movement that gets the NLRB to pay attention and tips the scales.
That was so beautifully put, and thank you so much for the Labor Lab shout out. That was really sweet.
Yeah.
We want to thank you so much for coming on to talk to us, and we definitely want to do some kind of follow-up episode as things develop.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for what you do. These things, money matters too. Spend your money with companies that are doing good. Stop buying Amazon, stop buying Starbucks if they're not going to support these things, because money is a transference of energy, and that's the only way we as a country are going to improve. So,
yeah. Well, keep us updated.
Thank you guys.
And thank you for coming on and talking with us.
Yeah. Have a good day, John.